All right, Hugh Marr, very, very warm welcome to Shamrocks and Shanks. Thank you very much, mate, for coming on the podcast. Really, really excited to have you on. Mainly as a little bit of background for the listeners, we kind of started chatting around maybe a little bit later towards the end of last year on the advice of a good friend of ours, Robbie King in Scotland. And you really changed a lot of how I see golf coaching, both in the education kind of side of things and in the actual application in lessons. So I think you're one of those guys that's really, really changing a lot of things in golf coaching, which I'm always all for. So that's why I'm excited to have you on this podcast. Help the listeners out there, both in terms of the club players and the coaches, get them to know you if they don't know you, and then get to know you a little bit better if they already do. So just for those people that might not be aware of, where you are, where you've come from, what you do really, really well, and perhaps a little kind of 2 or 3 minute introduction into Hugh Marr.
Oh, Lord. Well, first of all, thanks for having me on, Steve. It's always a pleasure to talk golf with fellow experts, and hopefully there's something in here that people can take from it. I am originally from Scotland, brought up in the west of Scotland in Glasgow. I moved down to London in 1999 to coach golf full time when I was 25, 26 years old, and basically embarked on a career which ended up in me coaching tour players on all the sort of major tours in world golf, which I did for the better part of 18 years. It was, I mean, I've been incredibly fortunate, blessed to have some amazing experiences that I never dreamt that I would have over the course of that time. But like anything, I think COVID kind of led me to reevaluate what was going on. The traveling was becoming harder and harder. And I decided at that point that the coach education was something where there was a need for some really good support for golf coaches worldwide. And I was the guy that was dumb enough to decide I was going to do it. So effectively, I've spent the last 3 years helping coaches. I still coach players of all standards, maybe not quite as often as I used to, but I still coach players of all standards. But the business now is entirely about educating coaches to do a better job.
Fantastic. So nearly kind of looking at it as coach's coach, really, in essence,
Yes.
which is good because, we'll get into this a little bit later on. And this is no critique, let's say, of the existing standards that are out there, but perhaps the education hasn't been to a sufficient high enough standard in terms of coaches getting educated up to this point. But again, we can talk about that a little bit later on. So let's kick off. The first half of the podcast really is to help those club players. So let's start there. And again, I think you have some great insights here. So what I always like to ask coaches, first question off the bat, is about kind of conceptions or perceptions of the club player. So what are a few of those perceptions that you come across on your own lesson tee, maybe the common ones, the misconceptions or the misunderstandings that the club player has that they feel they should be doing in their golf swing that really aren't that technically true at the moment?
Well, there's a ton of them, and they vary from player to player. I think it's maybe not a case of the misconceptions they have, but it's the conception or the concepts that they don't have is probably the single biggest issue. I, with club players, spend the majority of my time getting them to hit down on the ball more and get the club to bottom out in front of the golf ball. That seems to be something that the majority of club players either struggle with or don't understand how to do. Outside of that, the industry's changed an awful lot. Golf's changed an awful lot. And with the advent of the internet and social media, you get an awful lot more players coming with the concepts that they've seen online, which by and large don't apply to most players. So whatever tends to be trendy at the time becomes their favorite misconception right now. And we've seen it go from flexing the lead wrist to the top to shallowing the club in transition to now talking about ground force reactions. And I guess the skill for the coach is identifying, okay, well, number one, is that really what they need to do? But number two, the biggest skill is convincing the player who's come with these misconceptions that actually we need to take this in another direction.
Yes, very true. Kind of what they've kind of nearly believed for the last 3-4 weeks after seeing it and being bombarded with it on social media. And you're standing there trying to nearly convince them, hey, hang on a second, this might be true on its own, but when we put context to what you're doing, doesn't really apply to you.
The reality is that the flawed concepts and flawed beliefs are probably the very heart of why golfers struggle to improve. The problem with flawed concepts is that when you get them right, they still don't work. And the problem with flawed beliefs is until you shift them, it's next to impossible to get a player to embrace what they should be doing.
Yeah, very, very true. In the second half, as we mentioned in the second half of the podcast, we get more into detail about your coaching and your coaching philosophy, let's say, for want of a better term. But if we could use that structure term and apply it to the club golfer, where do you think the average club golfer kind of lacks in terms of the structure of learning? So the structure of practicing, the structure of improving their golf swing?
Well, certainly in my experience, not just coaching golfers, but coaching coaches, the players and the coaches that engage most in the process are the ones that will see the greatest improvement. And that's pretty much a law. That's something that I've seen time and time and time again. And it's the coach's job to ensure that they have all the information they need to be able to practice more effectively, to be able to create some transfer from the range to the golf course. All of these are pretty important skills that it's our job as golf coaches to impart on our players. I don't think it's acceptable to say to players that they need tons of reps and they've got to get worse to get better. I personally don't buy into that. Yes, you need enough quality reps to own any change that you make, but it has to be directed by the coach. Just hard work isn't the solution. The world's full of people that worked really hard in their game and not got any better. It's identifying what are the components that's going to help this player on their terms, whether they just want to hit good shots or whether they want to lower handicap. You have to approach it in different ways. If I'm dealing with players that want to reduce their handicap, then I'm going to take quite a deep dive into it from a statistical perspective so I can identify their low-hanging fruit. If people want different shots, I'm going to, again, identify where their low-hanging fruit is and work on that. And if they want prettier golf swings but really don't care about the outcomes, then I'll probably pass them on to someone else.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. And a good friend of ours, Mark Bull, will always say it's not what I want to teach you. It's about what you want to learn today. And for many different club players, as you just said, for some players they just want the swing to look prettier. For some players, they want to get that handicap down. For some players, they just want to beat their mate in the club medal next Sunday, whatever the case may be. And our job really, or the player's job too, both of us as a team, is to achieve that goal. And that can take on many different looks. You mentioned there a little bit about kind of trying to take that game to the golf course. And just before we get to the golf course side of things, in the practice, how important a role does feedback play for these players? And how often do you see that misconstrued or even not used at all in terms of when a club player is practicing or trying to learn on the range and there's no feedback mechanisms, and it nearly relies on one of the kind of phrases that I really don't like is swing thoughts, because thoughts don't really action anything. So a player might be on the range hitting a lot of balls, thinking about something, but with zero feedback. So do you see that as an issue too in terms of when players are practicing or club players are practicing?
I think it's probably there's a ton of significant differences between the very best players in the world and the rest of us, and feedback being one of them. That you have to have some effective feedback loop that reassures you that you're doing the right thing, or probably more importantly, is able to red flag when you're not. With the advent of technology, it's very easy to get club data, albeit an expensive exercise. Not everyone owns their own radar unit, but having effective feedback loops, which again has to be provided by the coach. If you hit this shot, you're not making progress. If you hit this shot, you are. So I had a guy this morning where basically we need to get the face in a slightly stronger position to the path. His feedback mechanism, if he's to hit really strong pull or draw shots that finish left of target, he's on the right track. If he hits them to the right of target, he's not on the right track. So even something as kind of crude as that is an effective feedback mechanism. The other thing that you tend to see, and this isn't exclusive to bad golfers versus good golfers, but I see a lot of players who don't spend enough time watching ball flights, relating them to fields, relating them to contacts, and effectively having a problem-solving process in place. Again, that would be a characteristic of the better players that I see, is that they understand how to solve problems. If this is happening, if they see this in the flight or the strike or the interaction with the ground, they'll process that in a way that leads them to make better conclusions. They'll ask themselves better questions.
So, and again, slightly jumping into the coaching thing a little bit early, maybe perhaps, but that phrase that's uttered sometimes, you need to get worse before you get better. I take it you would not be a believer in that phrase.
No, that is just toxic.
Yes.
because ultimately they've come to you to get better.
Yeah,
And
100%.
the reality is it's not a great sell to your clients that you're going to make them worse.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that's a little bit of I don't mean to be glib about this. Getting better at golf is hard.
Absolutely.
It's really hard. And what I will see a lot, and one of the reasons that I rely on technology as an integral part of my coaching, is that if I ask someone to make a change, I can see the data change straight away.
Mm.
And if the data's changed, but they're not necessarily hitting better shots, I know that they're on the path to hitting better shots. So again, it's this feedback mechanism. So I can change. I'd be really disappointed if I wasn't able to change a player's data, how the club impacts the ball and ground instantaneously. And by that, I mean between 1 and 5 shots.
Yeah.
That happens pretty much every lesson I give. That doesn't mean that they now are going to be that golfer. The process of owning that change is where time, engagement, effort is required. Physically changing the componentry required to influence impact is really genuinely very easy. If you understand not just the geometry of impact, but the forces at play and how players stand to the ball and move to produce that, there shouldn't be a question that you can make a player hit better shots. This morning, this guy I was talking about needed to increase his attack angle, needed to move the swing direction further to the right. First shot, he did both. Now, did he produce a functioning shot? No. But within 5 or 6 shots, they were becoming high functioning shots.
Yeah. And then we kind of circle back to that loop of the coach education, who's giving the lesson, having that ability, and therefore the club players' experience then becomes, let's say, a little bit more simplified, and they're less thinking, oh, that's okay because I have to get worse to get better. And this is, typically what I've known to be a golf lesson for the last 10 or 15 years, or that friend that said, oh, he got a lesson and he, it got a lot worse. Right. So it goes back to really who that coach is presenting the information.
Yeah. And good coaches improve players. I mean, it's really not that complex. Good coaches make players better, quicker.
Yeah.
Done.
Yeah. And as you said, a really, really nice kind of addition can be, even for the club players listening, when the coach does suggest to work on something in particular, perhaps asking that question, what shots might I see here at the start of working on this? Or if I see this shot go left or right, maybe where do I need to adjust in terms of what we're working on? So that we'll talk about this word a little bit more later on, but that spectrum of kind of what I might change or what I might see, which is very important.
Correct. And as a coach, not being afraid to say, I'm going to make this change to shift impact in this direction, and this is what the ball's going to do. It's okay to tell the student beforehand what the ball's going to do, because if you make the right change, it's going to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. As you said, at the end of the day, it is kind of geometry and physics with a human being mixed in to kind of mess it up a little bit, or make it a little bit more messy, let's say. But we are relying on geometry. Yeah.
It's geometry and physics. They're the simple bits. The anatomy and human operating system are the complicated bits.
Yeah.
But every golf lesson is navigating around those 3 areas.
Yeah. Like as we mentioned social media earlier on, and there's so many drills and exercises. And, I don't want to stand on a high horse here and say that everything I've ever produced has been perfectly correct, because it hasn't. Let's call a spade here. Like, we all learn as we develop. But we see, I'm sure you do when you're kind of going through social media, we see some of those clips that you just know plainly are not exactly correct. In terms of that, when the club players looking at drills or exercises, and you mentioned something earlier on, which I think is very important, that we refer to as low point. You talked about where that club makes contact more after the golf ball as opposed to with iron shots. Is there any drills or exercises that you would say, hey, if I was in a group of 60 people and had 60 golfers in front of me, I could pretty much give this exercise to all of you, and I think you would all get you would all improve because of it?
No. But you would improve a decent percentage of them.
Okay.
If we're talking about hitting down on the ball, which I think I assume you'll agree is probably the most common error you see.
Yeah, center this and that, probably. Yeah.
Yeah. And I talk about this a huge amount, in that we know that pretty much every great player in history, when the ball's on the ground, have hit the ground after the golf ball. So while there are very, very few absolutes in the golf swing, that is pretty close to being one of them.
Now we're talking about iron shots, just to be a little bit more.
We're talking about any time the club is on the ground.
Yeah, very good. Yeah.
And I honestly couldn't tell you, I don't think I've ever coached a better player who doesn't do this.
Mm-hmm.
So that's pushing us towards thinking this is pretty much an absolute.
Yeah.
Now, drills for that, I've got I use a yoga wedge, which I put behind the golf ball, which is a nice, that kind of angular shape is useful for getting them to picture how the club is going to descend into the back of the ball. And also off grass, I get a lot of players, and I do this myself in my own game, I get a lot of players to practice off a tee and just get good at breaking the tee at impact.
Mm-hmm.
And two very simple task-driven drills, if you like, that don't require explicit thought, but actually require the student to effectively solve a problem.
Mm-hmm.
How am I going to get that tee broken? How am I going to hit the ball without hitting that wedge that's put behind the ball?
Yeah.
And I'm very much a fan of going down that kind of less explicit coaching, more task-driven approach to coaching, a much more external focus rather than, well, what's my lead wrist doing as I change direction?
Yeah, and that's I think we kind of think in similar ways there when we're asking or trying to get a player to learn something, that if we can kind of nearly put it more in their hands by just putting in those kind of guidance systems like that little wedge, as you talked about, or like the tee. And so they're really doing the learning, the work, and it becomes a lot more innate to them a lot quicker that way. I think those drills,
there's a ton of research out there that problem solving is a far more effective way for people to learn than just being explicitly told the answer.
Yes.
So our job is to ensure that we analyze and diagnose the player appropriately, and then find the best way for that player to process the relevant change.
Mm-hmm.
Now, as I said, the research is very much in my favor here, or our favor here, in saying that getting a player to do a little bit of problem solving is really powerful, because they find their own way to solve the problem, number one. And because that's their way, it means so much more to them.
With drills and exercises, and again, there's a huge spectrum out there, a massive range of what they can do. Do you always have a context of wanting players to be hitting golf balls when doing that? And I know that sounds a little bit nearly kind of simplistic on a podcast about coaching, but we do see a lot of drills that revolve around the club being in across the shoulders, maybe some of those ones about trail arm where they're kind of lying on the trail arm, etc., using all kind of different tasks. But they're so far away from actually the task that we need to do, which is hitting a golf ball. Are you very conscious of trying to apply golf ball into all those tasks and drills you're doing? Or if you did something that was a little bit removed from that, is that okay as long as you maybe have a very limited time transfer between that task and actually hitting a golf ball?
As a general rule, the closer the drill is to an actual golf swing, including hitting a shot, the better.
Yeah.
Because you can do as many sexy dry drills as you want, as many convoluted drills as you want, but actually as soon as the player is being asked to apply club to ball, all bets are off.
Yes.
So my preference in terms of prescribing drills is that it looks like a golf swing and it involves an impact.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that's not to say that if you're trying to stabilize someone's pivot, for example, you might give them drills to learn to stabilize their pivot away from a golf ball, but that would only be part of the process for them. Mm-hmm. That might be where we start to develop the feel of making a more stable pivot, and then we would introduce some more probably constraint type drills, which actually involved hitting the golf ball. Mm-hmm. By and large, drills that look like really, really funky drills that don't involve an impact, I tend to stay away from. Now we've got guys like Alex Noren that makes a super extreme practice swing. Yeah, I would definitely say that he's the exception rather than rule. There's a reason he's one of the top 50 players in the world, because he is an outlier. He's found something that works for him. Yeah, that's not necessarily going to work for your club players.
And the interesting thing about Alex, and you probably know him a lot better than I do, is he has been doing that for a long time. Correct. So, and it doesn't change. So he's not doing that week 1 and then week 22 playing around with his grip and trying to get it back in and blowing the lead wrist. And But it's part of his
I guess, minimum operating standard from a performance perspective, from a swing perspective.
Yeah. You mentioned there quickly, and this is just the last question on the club players, because I think this goes back to something that I'm asked an awful lot and about tour players and elite players. And you mentioned how long you worked on tour with many, many great players who've won on tours, on all tours across the world. Does what you teach them really, really change in terms of those drills or those exercises? So just for those club players, like there seems to be a concept that sometimes there's this magic formula that tour players are being told on the ranges and stuff. And from my experience, it's pretty similar stuff, right? Depending, and it's not overly complicated. Would that be your experience, or do you feel like it gets a little bit more complex?
It doesn't get more complex. You're still dealing with human beings, and you're still dealing with the absolutes of impact. There's still that binary impact that can't be argued.
Yeah.
Where it does differ is that these people are, by and large, more able to process change. By and large, these people have a much better idea of what works for them and what doesn't work for them. I get this an awful lot from coaches, where they say, but it's different coaching good players. And I personally, my experience doesn't suggest that that's the case. Mm-hmm. We're still dealing with human beings. We've got to find the most effective way to communicate your principles to this player at this time. We're still dealing with the binary elements of impact. Yes, they may be more physically capable, but the reality is they're still human beings with human being operating systems. Mm-hmm. So I don't see a massive difference. And there's so much myth about good players being so different, and I just don't see it. They're just better. That's the difference.
Yeah, pure and simple.
Yeah,
and again, you're at the end of the day, you're still working on ball flight. You're still trying to change that ball flight to what the player desires, whether that be up, down, left, right, whatever they're trying to do. Moving into the coaching section, and because that nicely feeds on to my next question. As we just mentioned, you've worked with all spectrums of players. Okay, so from beginners right through to the elite in the world. Do you feel, in terms of a coaching perspective, that you've learned more from one end of the spectrum or the other? Or do you feel as you've gone, you're always going to be learning anyway, and you feel like it's all helping you?
I've been...
Sorry, I'll just throw in a little wrinkle there in terms of technical and in terms of actually being a coach. So coaching the individual.
I get asked an awful lot, who are my influences? And my biggest influences to this day, and it continues to be the case, are the players I coach.
Okay.
Because they're the ones that highlight my blind spots, my shortcomings, and they're also the ones that validate what I believe. Mm-hmm. And we all have these experiences as coaches. I think it's very easy to ignore our experiences. If I don't have an answer for someone, I have this fear and go and find the answer. I personally don't think that I'd learn more from good players or bad players. Maybe your bullshit filter with good players has found out a little bit sooner. But they've all influenced me. They all continue to drive me to becoming a better coach, developing my knowledge so that I get to that point where I'm not faced with anything that I don't understand or don't have an answer for, which I'll never get there, but I'm quite happy to continue to try and get there.
I think to me, that's a really, again, referencing the start when we started talking about my own coaching late last year. And we talked a lot about that bullshit filter and kind of nearly telling fairy tales in lessons. And I think all coaches at some point in time are guilty of that until the light is shone on it a little bit. And for me, definitely just what you mentioned there, when I started working more elite players, that definitely started bringing that to the fore a little bit, where I had to start re-examining the narrative that I was putting out there. And for me, so learning as we go, I think once I started talking to you, I applied it on all ends, but definitely at the start when working with those better players, they would challenge things a little bit more. And, with those better players, it's even more of a highlight. They're so good and so great at what they do. If nothing changes from your information, it's probably not them, so that's what I found.
There's a pretty simple feedback loop that if you've asked a player to make change A and they make the change and the impact doesn't improve, it's not the right piece of information.
Yeah.
Now, I'm not suggesting that it's wrong.
Hmm.
It might just not be entirely appropriate, or it might need another piece of information to make it work.
Yeah.
But if they're doing what you want and nothing's changed, you've not made them better. That piece of information is not relevant to that human being.
Yeah.
Now, as coaches, we have got that opportunity on every single shot in every single lesson to make that judgment call. And I don't see coaches doing that enough. Because the reality is, if they have made the change, it's not changed, nothing's improved about the impact, you've not shifted anything about where that club is in space, but they're doing what you want. No, it doesn't matter how many golf balls they go away and hit, they're still not going to see an improvement.
Yeah. It's just not happening.
So and having that, I mean, my great friend Andreas Cali, who I genuinely believe is one of the great golf coaches in the game, he's always talking about that if you can make the right change, you will get what you want out of it. The player will get what they want out of it. And he's acutely aware in his coaching that he's going to basically quality check the change that he's put in place. Because it's not having the right effect. If we're not running this predictive model, as Andreas calls it, that, okay, I've asked him to do this with the expectation of this happening. If you're not running that, you're just guessing.
Yeah. And at the end of the day, the person paying the money, the person in front of you deserves more than your guess.
You know what? All you can give the player in front of you is everything you've got.
Yes.
And if you don't have the knowledge, if you don't have the information or the skills, that's absolutely fine. We've all been there, and we will all continue to be there, hopefully less frequently as we get more experience. We've all been there. It's okay. Yeah. But it's not okay if you don't act on it.
Yeah, no, it's very, very true. And as you said, like from your experience, from every coach's experience, they learn, they process information, and they stand in that situation and they see a player do one thing and their brain reverts back to, okay, when I've seen that, this is what I predict should happen. And you implement it and it doesn't work. And that's absolutely fine too. You just got to recognize for this individual, the way they think, the way they see things, the way they perceive the world, maybe that doesn't match up. And that's when you have that conversation. And you got to be malleable enough to kind of go and say, okay, that wasn't the right thing. Let's try this other thing instead. And that's a grand conversation.
Don't be afraid to be wrong.
No, absolutely not.
And when you are wrong, don't be afraid to say, we're going to have to try something else because that hasn't worked.
Yeah,
that's
absolutely.
not had the desired effect. Yeah. It's okay to do that.
Yeah, it's all good. We talked about at the start, and you've taken more of a path of coaching education that you mentioned in the last number of years after COVID. What issues did you really see that led you to take that path? And are you encouraged by the reception that you've received from other coaches?
I've been massively encouraged because I suspected there was a need for it. I didn't suspect the need was as big as it is. Coaches are crying out for literally all over the world. Coaches are coming out the woodwork wanting to get better, and their biggest frustration is they don't know where to get better or how to get better, and that's where I come in. My concern with it was that we're just not doing a good enough job in making golfers better. That we're now in this part of history where we can quantify pretty much everything about the golf swing. About impact, about players' movement, about players' thought processes. I mean, we have a huge amount of opinion-free information available to us. Yet golf coaching is still a very anecdotal process. Soft hands, feel connection. Which we can't even define. You get 100 golf coaches together, they can't define what connection is. They can't define what release is. Our industry needs to become a little bit more objective and get away from sort of storytelling to make players better. Shifting impact is our primary aim. If we improve the impact of every single player that comes in contact with us, we have made the game better. They'll hit more good shots, less bad shots, and enjoy it more.
Where do you think the responsibility for that lies? Because and I'm not going to say it's a problem, we just have a situation now where we can't just throw it on the PGA regions anymore because there's more and more, and some very great coaches out there. So this isn't it, but there's more and more coaches that just aren't going through that system. Like, so George Gankis, Shaheen over in Montreal, fantastic coaches that just haven't. So we can't really throw it all on the PGAs. So how do we work this? Do we just rely on people like you to take the initiative, or how are we doing this? And I know you, we will mention you have started kind of sort of a system or a grouping together to kind of help with this. So how do we go about fixing it?
I think it needs people like me to stand up and say we can do better, and that's all I'm suggesting. And I'm including myself in this. This is not me saying golf coaching is shit, that golf coaches are useless. This is me saying we can all do better, because ultimately our clients deserve that. The game of golf deserves that. But it also requires a workforce. It requires coaches around the world to, number one, recognize that they can do a better job, which more and more are doing, and number two, have the guts to act on it.
You can say balls, sorry.
I was going to, but it's 2024 and I can't.
Okay.
But they have to have the guts to act on it.
Yeah.
And that's hard, because effectively we're asking human beings to admit that they can get better, that they don't know stuff, that they may not be doing a great job. That's very difficult for a lot of people to process.
I think you need to be in a position where you're wanting to get better before you can admit that you need to. Do you know what I mean? So, and one might lead to the other. And I remember when we first had our first conversation, we were talking over Instagram, and I basically like sent you this massive long text telling you where I was and how stuck I felt where I was, and that I didn't feel I was getting better. And you literally replied, you went, Steve, I get the exact same message nearly every single day from coaches. You're not alone. A lot of coaches feel the same way. So there is momentum gathering towards coaches who want to deliver that and know that there's the ability to deliver that higher efficiency of a lesson. And really, really, as you said, I think no coach wants to go into a lesson at the end of the lesson and go, I haven't helped the player. It's a shitty feeling. I know you and I are saying, like, you're driving home, like, and again, it doesn't feel good. So we all want to improve that. We all want to help as many players as we can. And I think from what you were doing, and some other coaches, Scott Cowkes over here in Canada does a lot of coaching education. I think that, the tide is turning a little bit, and that there's people out there to help.
Well, I think part of the issue, Steve, is that we need to stop looking at each other as competition, because trust me, we're never going to run out of bad golfers. We're never going to run out of golfers that want to get better.
Yeah. And
I am a firm believer, and this is something that's shown out through the programs that I run. I'm a firm believer that high functioning coach communities are crucial to the game of golf. And actually spending time talking to other coaches, sharing your experiences, sharing best practice, understanding that you're not alone, right? Mm-hmm. You're not the only guy that suffers from this.
Yeah.
Is really important. It's such a difficult job to become expert at, because there's so much that needs to be considered.
Oh yeah.
But knowing that there's other people out there who have experienced the same thing, who can share how they've dealt with this, maybe point you in the direction of resources, it's absolutely huge. We're not in competition with one another. We're just not.
Yeah, it's very easy to think like that, and nearly, if I admit that I'm not doing the best job, then I kind of feel like, I'm lesser than the other coaches. But, as I said, the really cool thing is that your name came up in a conversation, with Robbie King over in Scotland. And I was talking to Robbie, and Robbie's a good friend. And I was like, yeah, Rob, just feeling a little stuck here. And he goes, do you know who you should talk to? Hugh Marr is the guy to talk to. And that's where that came from. And then Mark Bull. So I think those circles are starting to get a little bit wider in terms of that education, which is fantastic. Now, I know you have a lot of programs that you run. You have your kind of the one-on-one that we do a lot together in terms of helping like clients, that nice kind of referral clients are looking over, kind of assessing what we do with clients, and then your actual programs, and then your in-person events. So we'll respect those as much as we can with the next question. But so without going into a mass amount of detail and giving it all away, can you shed some light on your lesson process and how you approach coaching, maybe referencing the spectrum system?
Okay. So if we accept that our job is to make golfers better, let's start there. Mm-hmm. And if we accept we're going to do a professional job, having system and structure to what we do is fundamental. Yes. Now, my system is very, 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 I don't want to say rigid, but it's very set, and it gives me plenty of room for flexibility for each and every individual. But I want to know what the ball is doing. I want to know the impact data it's producing. I want to know as much about that player's movement as I can before I make a judgment call on how I'm going to improve that player. So it's a very distinct, analyze the ball flight and the impact, diagnose what it is about that player's start position and movement or concepts, beliefs that is resulting in that movement and that impact.
Mm-hmm.
And then the final piece of the puzzle is figuring out the best way for me to help that player.
Mm-hmm.
So in a very, I need data to do that, so I can, number one, identify what needs to change. Number two, validate the changes that I'm making. Number three, provide feedback to the student. Mm-hmm. I'm trying to make this as objective a process from start to finish as it possibly can be. Where opinion and personal style and I guess the more anecdotal stuff kicks in is when you're physically coaching the player. Being able to say, listen, this is something I did with Martin Keimer that really helped him with this. But actually basing it on fact is a very decent start point. So that you know that you've done a good job and so that the student walks away knowing that what you've asked them to do is correct for them.
Yeah. And I think even doing it that way, I think nearly leads you to have a little bit more room for play or more room for maneuvering, because if you're very much looking, I always say this to players sometimes, I'm like, if I stood in front and to the right of Jim Furyk, so I was looking out to the range as he hit golf shots and I just saw the golf ball and just had a TrackMan or whatever launch man, and I just saw that, I'd be like, this guy's unbelievable. Wouldn't change a thing. And if I'd never seen the swing before and I looked at the swing first, you know, let's call it a spade a spade. If I'd never seen Jim Furyk before and I saw that swing on the range, you're probably going to go, holy shit, what's going on here? So the fact if you're kind of just really kind of basing a lot of things off the data and how that player creates those numbers, you actually can have a little bit more room for maneuvering in what they're doing style-wise, let's say.
Well, absolutely correct. And this is where I developed what I call my spectrums approach, because there is no one set of rules that you can apply to every player other than hitting down on the golf ball when it's on the ground. I'm going to call that a rule.
Okay.
So if I have a player that wants to draw it, their start position is going to look very good, very different from a player that wants to fade it. Mm-hmm. Why? Because setup position dictates your impact geometry. That's one of the reasons we choose to set up in certain ways. There is not a perfect setup that you can apply to everyone, but everyone has their perfect setup.
Yeah.
Now, I created the spectrums approach because basically I can, as long as I'm finding the right place on each spectrum and each component for the player, you start to match them up accordingly, what George Gankas calls matchups. You can start to pair them accordingly to produce functional ball flights. I know pretty much all the components in the golf swing in my system that there comes a point where a certain ball position becomes dysfunctional. That's the end of the spectrum.
Yeah.
So the ball position outside of the left shoulder when the ball's on the ground, there's a very decent chance that's dysfunctional because it doesn't allow appropriate impact geometry. And I've not seen many good players do that.
Yeah.
But then equally, if you go the other way, there comes a point where I've never seen any good players with the ball to the right of their sternum for each and every iron shot. So that's the other end of the spectrum where it's dysfunctional. But anywhere between them, assuming you match up the right components, anywhere between them can work. Mm-hmm. You have Dustin Johnson, who plays from that super flex position. We know that's worked. Why? Because he's won majors. We've got Marcel Siem, who plays from this position at the top. We know that works because he's won multiple times in the European Tour. Now, if I match some of Dustin's components with some of Marcel's components, we've made two super good players much worse. Yeah. But you can't tell me that this is less effective than this.
Yeah.
It's just not.
Yeah.
And both are perfectly viable. Mm-hmm. There is no absolutes here, other than generally, as I said, hit the ground after the golf ball when it's on the ground, and generally having the lead hand above the trail hand is, you could consider that an absolute until someone comes along playing cack-handed.
Yeah.
But the rest of it, it's up for grabs. So we can't have these absolutes. And I know that the human brain likes to organize things in tidy little boxes.
Yeah.
That's what's so hard about golf coaching is that the very limited absolutes make building different golfers into better players difficult.
Yeah. Yeah, I started doing this little task about 3 months ago, going on from what we talked about, and I have a little notebook and it's called the absolutes, and every morning I open up a page and a fresh page and write down what I believe to be the absolutes in golf swings. I think most I've ever gotten to is 3. And it's probably not even true. So
yeah, you don't need a notebook for that. You just need the back of the business card. That's all you need.
I know we're getting close to the end of time, so you just let me know when we're close there. you mentioned earlier on Andreas, who's such a fantastic coach, unbelievable coach. And we mentioned Mark too. And you've presented with both of those coaches in recent times, doing a lot of coach education courses and kind of live seminars. What really attracted you to presenting with other coaches? Because it's not something we're seeing a little bit more of it now, but again, maybe going back to previously, coaches very guarded about what they talked about, what they discussed. What kind of led you, especially with Andreas, because he's kind of like a little bit, I think he's in Norway or based over there. So what kind of led you to those kind of situations?
Andreas was easy because from the first moment we met, we argued like hell about everything. We agreed on absolutely nothing.
Perfect.
Apart from impact being king, that's where we start. Ball flight and impact are king. And the structure that we went through to analyze. So we both looked at ball flight first of all, then it went straight to impact, then went straight to P1, and then from 6 to 8, 5 to 9, we literally had exactly the same process without ever discussing.
Beautiful.
Everything else we argue about. And I was fascinated by Andreas because he's much more of a system close method approach because of his background and because of who he works with. Whereas he was fascinated by me. I think this was a compliment, but he said to me, I really wanted to know how you work because you've made players better without changing their golf swing.
Well, that's a big compliment.
And I'm like, is that a compliment? At the time, it didn't feel like a compliment. And he's based in Denmark, and for some reason, I've had pretty significant success with Danish players. So I came up on his radar because I worked with a lot of Danish players, and we sat down and we drank way too much beer. 4 a.m, we're like, sod it, we're going to start presenting together because we can give two polar opposite ends of the spectrum. We can give those two polar opposite opinions to coaches and help them decide on what's the best way to go.
Yeah,
and Billy and I have shared a studio since 2001. We've been together longer than we've been with our wives.
Is that a good thing or a bad thing?
It's definitely not a good thing, trust me.
So very, very quickly, just fantastic. Thank you so much for coming on. Before we kind of wrap it up, just to give you the opportunity, I know in terms of the social media side of things, so Instagram, it's just Hugh Marr Coaching. The website, I believe, is Coach Education, then HughMarr.com.
If you go to HughMarr.com, you can get led into whatever dark hole you want to visit.
Perfect. And what have you got coming up? So if a coach today kind of listens to this, jumps on the website, what are the opportunities you've got coming up for Coach Education? And we have the one-on-one mentorship, which we do together, which is fantastic. I'd highly, highly recommend that. What else is coming up with you and other partners? I think you're doing something with Steve Furlonger coming up.
Well, me and Steve are doing a ground force reaction camp in the UK at the end, I think it's May 28th, at my facility in Surrey. And Andreas and I are on the road. We're going to be at the Olympic Club in San Francisco at the beginning of June, the 9th, 10th of June off the top of my head. So any Canadian coaches that want to come and get involved with Andreas and I arguing for 2 days, you're more than welcome. We'd love to have you.
It's a good bit of banter. Don't worry, trust me. Hugh, from a personal note, as we talked many times before about this, changed my whole perspective on my career development, how I saw lessons, how I saw coaching. And so that's why I'm very, very keen to, really let people know how good you are at this. Because I think all coaches should, worst case scenario, get on the phone with you and have a conversation. Because we can all improve. We can all learn. So very, very, again, just really thanking you for your kind of help from my perspective and the work you're doing in general. Because I know it doesn't always get rewarded in terms of like trying to help coaches get better. But I think you're doing a great job. It's needed. I've said this to you always. One of those issues with young coaches coming up wanting to get educated is where to look. And there's so many avenues that if they look down the wrong avenue, unfortunately, they're going to work hard at it and end up probably in a worse place than they did before. So having more guys like you, Scott, kind of helping with the education and coming at it from a really, really good place too. Like it's not, this different process or something. It's a very, once people talk to you, they'll understand it a little bit more, but it's a beautiful way of looking at golf coaching, a very structured way. And I think that really, really helps. So thank you for all you're doing over there. We really, really appreciate it. I know myself, Robbie, all the other guys really appreciate what you're doing. You also have the CMAS program, which is another side of things for coaches if they want to get involved in. Again, that's advertised on the website. So all these things are on the website. It's a fantastic website. You'll see the coaching education options as you go on. There's actually courses from you and Andreas that you can actually purchase that you've already done on video. So you could start learning today if you're a coach out there. But again, thank you so much for coming on, spending time with us. I really, really appreciate it. And we'll talk to you again soon.
Thanks, Steve. Thank you for your kind words. It's a pleasure to work with you.
Absolutely. Always.
Take care.
Talk to you later.
Bye-bye.